Great. Okay, welcome back, and those of you at home, I hope you've had a chance for a cup of tea. We've just finished ours here. I'm just getting something photocopied for people in the room, which I will be referring to in a moment. But in the meantime, I just want to have a look at this slide, which is by way of summary, I suppose, for what we've done in the last hour or so. And this is just an annual checklist. It's a useful thing to take stock, maybe at the end of the calendar year, or whatever time frame is appropriate for your board, just to take stock of a number of things, including, for example, what subcommittees and working groups you have in place. So here you'll see simple advice, but very practical advice. All redundant committees should be eliminated. I know that sounds like a very stark word, but you can eliminate the committee, not the people, hopefully. But certainly I think, the practical issue there is if it's really not fit for purpose, not serving its purpose, then that may well be the time to call time on it and close it down. Ask that question, are they serving their function well? And this is where the board of the organization itself takes a strategic perspective on this, among other things, at maybe at the end of the year. So if the function of the subcommittee isn't being served, then that's also raising issues that may well have to be discussed and may well include the prospect of finishing up that work. Do they have adequate expertise? So we talked earlier about the importance of having people with the right skills and experience and expertise on subcommittees. So to check in on that is important. You may well find at some point along the way it becomes apparent that the expertise needs to be widened, and that may well be where the subcommittee is getting into the meatier issues and problems, and they realize, okay, well, we now need somebody else, an expert in a particular field, to help us with this. That's where, of course, other people can join the subcommittee along the way. Is membership rotated? And that may well be an important consideration for some subcommittees. There is always a danger they become stale, similarly to the board of the organisation itself. Board rotation is important, subcommittee rotation can also be important. A bit more difficult with subcommittees, particularly if you're depending heavily on particular skills and expertise. Sometimes at a national level even, you may find those skills are not readily available. So obviously you have to take a practical approach to that and decide, okay, if there are people out there, we'll try and bring new blood into the subcommittee. But if it can't be done, it can't be done. So you obviously have to take stock of that yourselves. We find we do a lot of work in Carmichael Centre with rural community groups, and their perennial problem is finding and holding on to board members. So you'd find a small parochial group maybe down the country with a relatively small catchment area, relatively small population, and you find that the same people are actually on multiple boards of multiple organisations and committees. Thank you. And of course, when it comes to talking about subcommittees, that's when they start to groan and they say, well, look, we're already at the end of our tether, and we simply don't have enough time to serve, or we don't have enough people to serve on subcommittees. I think my record that I've heard to date was a man in South Tipperary. I won't mention the town in South Tipperary, but he told me he was on seven committees in his locality. So I was kind of thinking he probably doesn't have any evening of the week where he is not doing something on behalf of one of those subcommittees or one of those committees. So that's a practical consideration for people, and I suppose people do need to ask themselves, am I demanding too much from myself, and am I able to serve the interests of the organisation appropriately? And if the answer to either of those is no, then that's where a person maybe needs to take stock of what they're trying to do with the best will in the world and what is actually happening. So very important, I think, to be pragmatic when it comes to these things. Just to mention, I suppose, some of you may well be familiar with statutory bodies out there. A lot of community-based organisations are funded by PUBL, so many people will have dealt with Pobal or certainly will be aware of the role of Pobal in supporting community and voluntary initiatives. Pobal is, if you like, the conduit for government funding for a lot of community-based initiatives and supports. So quite a lot of the resources that keep the doors open for community-based work come from Pobal. And Pobal, of course, quite rightly, is very clear that it needs good governance within those organisations and good structures and also good reporting mechanisms. So they are very clear in their own heads. If we don't see that in the organisation, then we're not in the business of funding those organisations. So it's a pretty clear remit as far as Pobal is concerned. Pobal they've produced a number of guidance documents. Some of you at home might be familiar with a toolkit that they've produced in the last number of years. It's the Managing Better toolkit. And they do provide that to organisations that they're directly involved in. And that's quite a good set of practical guidance documents and pointers on how to manage your community-based initiative better. Carmichael Centre was involved in helping with that. We delivered some training around the country on it. We're also helping Pobal to review some of the guidance that needs to be updated at this stage. So we're having a look at that at the moment. But I just had a look back the other day at the Pobal advice around subcommittees, and they do have a section in it on how to manage and run subcommittees at community level. And they did talk about, for example, making sure if you're employing people, there may well be a need to have a HR, human resources subcommittee to review policies around employment and good practice. So that would be an important consideration to get that right. There may well also be a selection subcommittee where you're looking at selection of board members, new board members, and also perhaps selection of the role of CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, or the manager, or whatever title is used for that person. Often the small community-based initiatives have that onerous responsibility of finding, recruiting, and holding on to a good manager, and that's always a difficult task. Some of the working groups it talks about in the Managing Better toolkit is a committee of inquiry. For example, you may have to set up a committee of inquiry if there's a disciplinary issue has arisen, or also there may well be special events committees. So you may well decide, okay, we're going to have a major event this year to raise awareness or to raise funds or whatever. So let's set up a subcommittee to manage that. So very much in tune with some of the stuff that we've talked about this morning. Okay, I'm going to refer you to a handout, and I'll just get it here. And I'll give one to everybody. There you go. Yeah, do there. Okay. Now, sorry, I've given mine to you. Okay, so I'm just going to hold this up for the camera. This is a handout on managing subcommittees and working groups that I actually did on behalf of Carmichael Centre a number of years ago. This is available to you from CPA. So those of you at home, you will be able to get a copy of this by email from CPA. I'm just going to have a look at some of the elements in the document. I'm not going to labour this. I'm not going to laboriously go through the document, but there are a few useful pointers. We have also published this document in Carmichael Centre. There is a website which we manage called KnowledgeNet, and that has a lot of information on how-to information. If you check the Carmichael website, there is a link to that. But you will be getting this, so rest assured, whatever I'm looking at here on this sheet of paper, you will be getting this from CPA as well. It's around creating terms of reference for subcommittees. And again, we often write these articles in Carmichael Centre in response to questions that come into us. So sometimes people will come to us with that very question. How do we write terms of reference for subcommittees. We've never actually done this before, so we tried to come up with some practical advice. And you'll see on the first page, and if you don't have access, don't worry. When you get it, you'll see on the first page that I've done a series of top tips, and that's by way of summary of the document itself. So I'm just going to go through the top tips. I'm not going to read everything on the document. But the 8 tips that we've distilled out of this document is, first of all, check your governing document to see if the board has the power to set up subcommittees. So that's very important. If you don't have the powers to set up subcommittees under your constitution, then you shouldn't be in the business of actually setting them up. Be clear about the purpose of the subcommittee before setting it up. So this comes back to the point earlier that there needs to be good reasons to have subcommittees in place before you actually go to the trouble and the time, very valuable time, of course, in actually setting them up and running them. The third tip is to decide on the level of decision-making powers of the subcommittees. So make sure in the terms of reference for the subcommittee that you're clear that there are limitations on those powers and they don't have a carte blanche to do whatever they like. And I think that's a very important consideration. The fourth point is state how often the subcommittee reports to the board. So there should be regular communication back to the board from subcommittees. They can't just go off on their own tangent and decide a year later they're going to report back. So the board needs to be updated. The fifth point is ensure the subcommittee meetings are chaired and minuted. So the same rules apply to any subcommittee as would apply to the board. You should have a proper chair in place and there should be minute taking happening and proper minute taking, which is an accurate reflection of the work of the subcommittee, no more than the minutes of a board meeting are an accurate reflection of that work as well. The sixth point is set a quorum for subcommittee meetings. So your quorum, of course, is the minimum number of people or the minimum percentage that you would have in attendance at subcommittee meetings. And again, you may well have a similar rule to rules already in place for your board. What you don't want is a subcommittee of one. So you end up appointing a number of people and then one person is simply running the show. Number 7 is include at least one board member on the subcommittee. So always good practice to have that direct link back to the board. So keep a board member on the subcommittee, and you may well have your internal rules about whether that person should chair the subcommittee or not. And the final point, number 8, is don't set up too many subcommittees. So again, be practical, as I mentioned earlier. You may well try to walk that tightrope between having too few and having too many and finding what suits best for your organisation. So all of those top tips are on page 1 of the actual document itself. I'm not going to go through much of the other details. There's one section on the second page, this is on page 2 of the document, which refers to the terms of reference. So if you are looking to set up a subcommittee and you've never done it before, here are some practical tips on what the terms of reference would contain. So I'm not going to read it all for you, but the headings are, make sure you have a proper name. So choose a name that actually is reflective of the work of the subcommittee. You'll need to also look at membership. How do you make up the subcommittee itself? How do you appoint people to the subcommittee? And what authority the subcommittee has, so what levels of authority exist. You also have to have minutes, so the record of the meetings is important. You also need to identify the practical issues of how frequent and the duration, so how long should the committee meetings be. You may well have to identify positions on that subcommittee, being the chair, maybe on the secretary, they're the obvious ones. And you also have to decide on the quorum, so making sure that you have a proper quorum for the work of the subcommittee. There is an interesting section on the bottom of page 2, which we really don't have a lot of time to go into, but in fact it talks about the pitfalls. When you set up subcommittees, there are a number of pitfalls that may well be pitfalls you've already seen at board level. And it talks about things like breakdowns in communication. So that can be internal to the subcommittee itself, no more than within the board itself. You have breakdowns of communication and conflict, and those things do arise. Sometimes people imagine there'll never be conflict in our organization, but of course it can erupt at times, and sometimes that can be a good thing. If people feel strongly about certain issues, a certain amount of conflict can be useful, and it can help people to galvanize their thoughts and resolve issues. Also, you may well have powerful cliques within the board or within the subcommittee. You may have inappropriate influence over decision making, and you may well have a subcommittee that ceases to have a valid purpose. So all of those issues, again, may well go back to the chair, and a good chair will hopefully anticipate and mitigate against those things going out of control for the subcommittee. I'm not going to go through really the rest of the document. On the third page, you've got more detail about the now this is actually the finance subcommittee. So as opposed to an audit subcommittee, you've got a finance subcommittee outlined for you there. And then on the following pages, it gives you more details about what that subcommittee would look like. So I won't go into all of that with you. There is a little jargon buster at the end of the document which I will leave with you. Sometimes people get confused about the terminology. So it's always useful, even with very experienced boards sometimes, it's always useful to check in. Do people have a consensus in their understanding of what terminology is being used? I was talking to a group the other day, and one of the ladies in the group kept using the word capacity. And she was saying, we have the capacity, but actually she didn't quite understand the word capacity, and it was really demand was what she was talking about. So they didn't have capacity, but there was demand, but she was mixing up the two terms. I mean, it seems kind of silly when you point that out, but she had the other board members completely confused because the discussion started out about, our lack of resources and our need to do something. And this particular person seemed to be saying the opposite by constantly reiterating we have capacity. But in fact, what she meant was there's a huge demand for our services out there. She actually did understand that there wasn't enough capacity within the organization. So I'd always say, just be careful about how terminology gets thrown around at meetings. And particularly if there are new members of either boards or subcommittees, just make sure there is a consensus on the language being used. Language can be peculiar to different organizations. And a language evolves in time between the people within boards and within the organization itself, which is mutually understandable, but difficult for other people to access. So just to make sure that you have some understanding of that. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's really all I'm going to say on subcommittees and working groups. We're now going to go on to the next section, which is federations and branches. And I'm going to look at some examples of federations and branches that some of you may well have come across. Could I just check in the room, are any of you involved in organizations that are federated, in other words, made up of different subsections, if you like? I'm wondering about the housing organization. How is that structured? Is it just one entity in its own right?
One entity, but there is one in particular that is a cooperative.
Okay.
It's one very large association that is a cooperative.
Okay, so you have one large association that is a cooperative. You don't have a number of satellite organizations attached to that. You don't have a number of satellites, okay, because other organizations may well have quite complex structures. Have anybody else come across those kind of setups?
I've only just started to volunteer with DGCS.
Okay. Yes. Okay, so we have one person here who has just started with VDP, Vincent de Paul. I'm actually going to refer to Vincent de Paul in a moment, so we'll actually have a look at how that is structured. The church that you're involved in, Nyenga, is it just one mothership, or do you have a number of subsections? Mienga is... Are you thinking about it? No. Okay, so no thoughts on that one. Okay, because I know some church structures can also be very complex and they may well have a number of different... The board, the actual board itself. Do you have one board or... Yes. Do you have boards around the country as well, or
because
committees?
They have a network, and every branches have its own governance board.
Aha, okay. So you have a federated structure.
More than 100 branches in Ireland.
100 branches. Okay, so he's just explained that it's a more complex setup than maybe a lot of organizations in that you have a head for the organization plus about 100 branches around the country. So what we're going to talk about now is actually quite relevant to your particular setup. Those of you at home, of course, you can think yourselves about different kind of structures. You probably have come across them either in your own work, or you may well be aware of organizations out there that are both national and regional. And we just look at some of the issues that can arise for these types of structures. And again, this is not prescriptive. So I'm not telling you this is the way to do it, or this is the right way, or this is the wrong way. There are a million different permutations and combinations. So the first bullet point here on this slide is there are no definitive models. No two structures are the same. So lots and lots of different ways in which organizations have evolved. And looking at, say, a branch structure, you may well have a national body. So national bodies can provide services that are complementary to local branches. So you may well have a national body based in Dublin, not always based in Dublin, of course. In fact, we have one organisation based in Cork with a branch in our office in Dublin in Carmichael Centre. So it doesn't always revolve around Dublin. You have national bodies that can provide services directly to beneficiaries. So you may well have a national body with branches, but the services are coming from the head office as well. You have some national bodies' prime purpose, which is to support local branches. So again, you may well have a national body that is simply in a support role for branches, regional branches that are geographically spread around the country. And this isn't always about geography. It may well not be contingent on geographical presence. It may well be simply different branches for different purposes. You might have local branches that are fairly homogeneous. So you'll have lots of local branches providing similar services, but alternatively you might have local branches that deliver different services depending on different local needs. So lots of different permutations and combinations, and advantages and disadvantages to each. So I'm going to just show you some examples to illustrate the point. This makes it a little bit easier to see. So Vincent de Paul, for example, they are a national council which is based in Dublin, but they have societies based around the country. So you've got Bandon, Vincent de Paul, you've got Mount Mellick, Vincent de Paul, and you pick any town and you may well find there is a branch of Vincent de Paul there. The information that I've put on this slide, by the way, has come from the Charities Regulator. So if you look at the Charities Regulator's website, you can see pretty quickly how different national bodies are structured. The Samaritans, I'm sure you've come across the Samaritans. Samaritans Ireland are based in Dublin, but there are registered charities around the country. For example, Waterford Samaritans, Galway Samaritans, etc. And those are entities in their own right. So the Waterford Samaritans is registered as a charity. Galway Samaritans are registered as a charity. Volunteer Ireland, which actually started in Carmichael Centre many years ago, is now, of course, a national body in its own right. It's based in Dublin, but it has volunteer centres in each county. So I think practically every county has at least one volunteer centre, and those centres are very intimately linked back to the head office in Dublin. I'm sure you've come across citizens information boards around the country, but there is a Citizens Information Board Dublin, and then you have, of course, Citizens Information Services nationwide. You find Citizens Information Board head office produces a lot of materials and guidance for the various citizens information services around the country as well. In Carmichael Centre, we deal a lot with sporting bodies. A lot of national sporting organisations come to us for help. And we deal with Sport Ireland. Sport Ireland is the head office, if you like, based in Blanchardstown in Dublin, and they provide guidance and services and supports for all of the various national sporting bodies. And just to illustrate how complicated that can be, the national sporting bodies are individual entities in their own right. So you have, for example, Kayaking Ireland, you have the Ladies Golf Union of Ireland, you have the Deep Sea Divers of Ireland. There are so many national organisations out there, it's quite bewildering at times. Each of those national organisations may well have regional structures. So they may well have a Cork office, they may well have a Dublin office or a Galway office, and each of those may well have clubs attached to them. So you've got a whole series of layers that are really quite complex and difficult to control and difficult to manage. So one of the issues, I suppose, that I'm raising here is the more complex those structures become, the more responsibility there is on the organisation to make sure that it works in the interests of the organisation. The last thing you need is different parts of the organisation at odds with each other. And you may well find that arises. Welcome, Fran. Welcome. Thank you. Our guest speaker has just arrived. I'll introduce you in a little while, but relax for the moment. So one of the issues that can arise, and I have seen this happen with a number of quite complex setups, is you'll find that different regional interests start to interfere with each other. And you may well find that some people will try to champion the interests of one region as opposed to another. And sometimes when you look at the national board, that becomes quite a complex and difficult syndrome where you have people pulling against each other rather than pulling with each other. And sometimes that can lead to conflict. And boards will sometimes, national boards will have to go back to the drawing board and see, okay, how do we make sure this works in the best interests of all of the constituent parts of the organisation and the people who access the services of the organisation. As I mentioned, in Carmichael Centre, we have a number of interesting structures. Hope Foundation, Cork, you may have come across the Hope Foundation. They're actually an organisation that was founded in Cork, and have been running very successfully out of Cork for quite a number of years. Strategically, they decided they wanted to set up a branch in Dublin, and that was to access various stakeholders that are based in Dublin. So there was a practical consideration for the Hope Foundation, and they subsequently asked Carmichael Centre, could we provide an office for their Dublin activities. They now have been involved with Carmichael for a number of years. Another example in Carmichael Centre, you may not have heard of them, but they're the Neurological Alliance of Ireland. The Neurological Alliance of Ireland. That's quite an interesting structure in that the Neurological Alliance, or NAI as it's referred to, is an advocacy group on behalf of quite a lot of different organisations that are involved in services and supports for people with neurological conditions. So you have MS Ireland, for example, would be a member, and quite a few different organisations. The Neurological Alliance is a very loose federation in terms of its board is made up entirely of the members of the alliance, but each of those member groups is independent in its own right. So each of those groups has its own interests, it runs its own services, and then it comes together periodically to champion and to advocate on behalf of a whole range of different neurological conditions. And that can be quite an important federation in terms of making sure you capitalize on mutual interests and collective interests, and that can be quite powerful. One of the issues, of course, for the Board of Neurological Alliance is having so many different hats around the table. So people are walking into the board meetings wearing the hats of the various constituent bodies. and trying somehow or other to put on the hat of the Neurological Alliance and champion the collective interests of that federation. That all doesn't always work, and there's always tensions, natural tensions that arise between the various different people. Somehow or other, they make it happen, and they make it work in the interests of the various different bodies. And at the end of the day, when people are at those board meetings on behalf of the Neurological Alliance, they are very much aware that our strength is in our collectivity. So once they get that and once they see that it's in their interests to do that, then it works well for them. So just to have a look at a federal structure, and we'll just look at this in a bit more detail. And a federal structure organisation, it comprises both a national body and a number of local independent groups. And again, this isn't a prescriptive set of PowerPoints or of bullet points. This is just by way of illustrating it. Local groups may well have a lot of autonomy, but their mission is aligned with the national body's mission. So you may well find quite a loose connection with the various local groups, but there is hopefully a consensus on what they are all trying to do collectively. And I suppose the problem then is, or the challenge is, to ensure that the autonomy aligns with the shared mission. So there is a national understanding, if you like, that there is shared interest being served here, and the various different organisational parts understand the collective intentions, as it were. And then I suppose sometimes when it comes to the composition of the board of a federal body, that's where it becomes difficult, because you may well find the board is weighed significantly in favour of some organisations as opposed to others. And some organisations may well feel we're not being heard. So we're actually on the board, but we're being eclipsed by either stronger individuals from larger organisations or cliques within the board that are championing the interests of maybe 2 or 3 different organisations at the expense of other organisations. So that can be a particular challenge, I suppose, for these types of structures to actually work their way through. And it is a never-ending challenge. I think that challenge always rests in the background. With the branch structure, then, you're looking at constitutionally one organisation. So this is where you have simply one organisation that is registered probably as a company and or a charity. And then the branches are part of the national organisation and share its governance structure and mission. So now we've got a much stronger alignment with the mothership, as it were, where the branches are part of the whole and serving the interests of the whole. So the challenge here is ensuring that local and regional branches comply with the overall rules. So hopefully there are fairly clear guidelines coming from head office on what the various branches are meant to be doing. That's not always a given. Sometimes there can be a lack of clarity. Sometimes there may well be a deliberate obfuscation of what is meant to be done, and people will start to go off on their own tangents. So I think it's very important to have that discussion internally if it looks like that isn't working very well. And we have seen examples where people really felt there was a conflict of loyalties for them. Are there loyalties to the head office? Are there loyalties to a local branch? Or how do they align those loyalties without having them clash with each other? And often those boards are very complex in their makeup and in how they manage themselves. It is, I suppose, an opportunity, if you haven't got one, is to have a board code of conduct. And the board code of conduct may have quite specific guidelines on how the actual branch network functions. Yeah?
Under the branch structure and the federal structure, are they out there, all the, like the federal structure, let's say they have the local supportive center, are they have one board that governs all the branches, or they have their own separate board?
Now, to make it simpler, what we've done here is we've identified the branch networks as having one registered entity, whereas a federal structure will have a whole lot of different registered entities. And I'll come back to that point when we just look at reporting, because when you report to the charities regulator, you have to be very careful how that works if you're a registered charity. So hold that thought and I'll come back to it. The other issue to bear in mind with branch structures is confidentiality, and I've seen organisations fall foul of this problem where confidentiality is breached, and you may well find somebody from a branch is a member of a national board and they have breached either what would be considered norms of confidentiality, or they've actually breached the rules of confidentiality. So they may well have been asked not to reveal information to people at branch level, and then they've gone running home and have said, wait till I tell you what was discussed at the board meeting today, and of course that is simply not on. So I think people do need to understand there are responsibilities that go with wearing a national hat if they're on that board. So looking at the charities regulator, and this is where you drill down to practical issues. So if it is registered with the charities regulator, so in other words, either a branch structure or a federal structure is registered as a charity, look at what the charities regulator is saying. And I have taken these bullet points from the charities regulator's website. In fact, you'll see it yourself on charitiesregulatoryauthority.ie. Anybody who has been involved in registering a charity are probably very familiar with that. But it's quite clear the regulator has a number of guidance documents, and one of them is around federal and branch structures. So for a federal structure, they're saying individual groups have their own trustees, and the word trustee is used by the regulator to refer to board members. And of course, board members can be made up of directors and board members. Each group submits an annual report and accounts to the regulator. So it's very clear from the regulator's point of view, federations are a collection of individual entities in their own right. The national body must inform the regulator when new groups are formed. So that's an interesting point for national bodies to bear in mind. If they are a recognisable federation, the national body has a responsibility to keep an eye on the various different entities that are aligned with the federation. Individual groups can apply for charitable tax status in their own right. So of course they can go to the revenue commissioners and also register for tax status, as well as registering as registered charities. Now look what it says about branch structures. This is much clearer in terms of having a single entity in place. So this is a single registered charity with one single board. And this is very clear from the regulator's point of view how it functions. There is a single constitution governing the whole organisation. So from the charities regulator's point of view, if you're calling yourself a branch network, you really have one entity, one constitution. There has to be a single annual report to the charities regulator from the whole organisation. So the regulator is not interested in hearing from various branches around the country. If it's only registered as one entity, the regulator only wants to hear from one entity. And there's a set of consolidated accounts for the whole organisation. And that's, of course, where the organisation needs to be very careful about how it manages its money as well. And I'm going to just go into a little bit more detail on the money side of things, because this is also where things can get complicated. I'm giving you what I'm calling possible guidelines on fundraising. And notice the word possible guidelines on fundraising, because this is not prescriptive in any sense of the word. These are suggestions for you on how this kind of structure can be managed, and then it's up to each organisation to set its own parameters on how this works. I've seen quite complicated scenarios arise when it comes to fundraising for complex entities that are scattered around the country. So just a few points to bear in mind. Groups in both federal and branch structures can fundraise in their own right. So you may well have decided, okay, well, we let people at a regional level raise money in their own right, but you must need to be careful then how you manage that. One of the questions is, can money raised locally be kept for local use? And you may well decide yes. So if a Cork branch raises money in Cork, then let that money be spent in Cork. You may well have a different rule on that. You may well decide, no, we need to have a much more centralized control. So therefore, all money raised locally needs to go to head office. And then it can be dispensed back to the individual services that are being provided. And one of the issues arises over people's perception of how that happens, because there can be different perceptions when you're rattling a bucket on the street about where that money is actually going. And the last thing you need is somebody in Galway saying, oh, there's a Cancer Care West, good example. There's Cancer Care West. My auntie has cancer and she's in Portiuncula Hospital, so I'm going to give money now for my auntie. And then at some point along the way you realise, well, actually that money has all gone up to Dublin. And that's where people need to be really clear about how those things are managed. So you may well find the third bullet point, a national body can raise funds in the area of a local group. So you may well have those powers within a national body to operate at local level as far as fundraising is concerned. Fundraisers must make it clear to the public which part of their network they're funding for. So that's very important. If you have fundraisers rattling boxes on the street in Galway or Dublin or Limerick, they must be clear on how that actually works. Fundraising must be coordinated to avoid duplication and to clarify different funding needs. So one of the things that I saw with a federation a few years ago was the national body had actually advertised a major fundraising event, and a branch down the country had simultaneously advertised locally a different fundraising event on the same day. So you can imagine the confusion that was causing for members of the public or for supporters of the organisation, saying, hang on, one bit of the organisation is clearly not talking to another bit. So that's where you have to mitigate against that. And then the final point is there must be consistent communication on fundraising between national and local staff, members, supporters and street collectors. So the various different people out there need to understand, there are different lines of communication that need to be kept open going in different directions. So very important to understand that. Now, for some guidelines on that, there are what are called the guiding principles for fundraising. Some people may be familiar with these. This is a set of principles that were developed a number of years ago, and they are actually to be found on the website of the Charities Institute Ireland. Some of you may be familiar with that organisation and its website. It's got some very good information, particularly for people involved in the fundraising world. So these guiding principles, they provide Irish charities with good practice standards for fundraising. So you'll actually see what is the good practice in relation to how people conduct fundraising either at national or local level. And it actually drills down to issues like how do you make sure if somebody is rattling a box on the street that they can answer questions about the organisation. So if somebody says to you, you're rattling a box on Henry Street, if somebody says, okay, tell me about the organisation, tell me what this organisation does, the person who is raising the money should have insight, so they should be properly trained to answer relevant questions. These guidelines, and in fact the charities regulator is the owner of the guidelines, the actual tools for and guidelines for individual fundraising activities belong to the Charities Institute, but they increase public trust and confidence. So if people say, okay, we've got an organisation that has signed up to good practice, then we're more willing to give them money. It demonstrates the charity operates to high standards, so it's all about maintaining standards. It provides clarity and assurances to donors about the organisation they support. So people are, quite quick to ask those questions now. Where's my money going? How do you reassure me that it's being managed properly before I give you money? So it's very important, I think, for people to understand that from the other point of view as well. So if you want to, you can of course check charitiesInstituteIreland.ie. There's a section on their website called Principles for Fundraising, and it does need to be looked at if you are involved in a charity that works at both national and local level. Even if you're not a charity and you're based in, you're in the business of fundraising, you should also look at those guidelines. I just want to raise the issue of membership, because membership of organizations can be problematic. And I've worked with a number of organizations where there seemed to be a lot of fuzzy thinking around the issue of who our members are. So different organizations will have different understandings of what makes up their members. So just to clarify this for you in the context of what we've just talked about, first of all, any organization should make sure they know who their members are. And I have asked that question of a number of organizations. Do you know who your members are? And there were very different answers from different people within the organization. So it's a matter of making that clear to yourselves. The members of the company, so you have membership of your company. If you're a CLG, a company limited by guarantee, you'll have a set of identified members, and they're entitled to vote at general meetings that should receive company information. So, for example, at the AGM, you are required to invite your members to the AGM, and they potentially wield quite a lot of power. They can vote on substantive issues at AGMs and influence the direction of the organisation. There may be different categories of members in the organisation. So you might have, for example, service users and their families. Naturally enough, they would be considered a primary stakeholder and may well be considered members of the organisation. They're not members of the company as such, but they're members of the organisation. Yeah? Yeah?
Concerning the number to the members of the company, are they entitled to vote at the general meeting?
Yes.
I want to ask, is it a good practice for the religious body? I don't think they don't allow them to vote because the man of the priest, that appoint the board of trustees. Is that a good practice?
Okay, so the question is around a religious body.
Yeah.
And whether it is possible, I suppose, to have members of the church, as it were, having that power to vote at your general meetings. It's a difficult one for religious bodies, and I've worked with a number of religious bodies that struggled with how exactly that hierarchy works for them. And sometimes, of course, there can be very hierarchical structures that are either there for historical reasons or there for the I suppose, to fit with the ethos of the actual church itself. Well, now you need to be careful when you look, are you registered as a company?
Yeah.
So this organization is registered as a company limited by guarantee.
Yeah.
Now, regardless of how you consider your membership, you must identify a core group of people who are called company members. And those company members have the right to come to your annual general meeting and to vote at that annual general meeting. So you need to be really clear. You might have a wide family within the church, but you have a core group of members that actually have voting rights at AGMs.
What I'm trying to say is that member of the company may not properly be the in-house people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you are saying.
Yes, you could have members anywhere. So you could have members scattered around the country. But once you set up, for example, an AGM, you need to invite your members to it. So very important to be clear in your own structures how you actually manage that. If you like, have a chat with me afterwards and we'll see, because I know there are quite complex issues that can arise with those kind of structures and they may not be entirely relevant to other people. Yep.
If you have a membership of your organisation, say a large membership like voluntary situation, and you allow them to vote at AGMs,
Yes.
they have a say, let's say, board members are nominated and they need their approval
Yes.
and resolutions. Does that automatically make them members of the company, or do you have a right as a board then to maybe look at that and say, we want to restrict that back to a tighter?
Yes, the question is around, and in fact a very practical question is around how you identify the membership in terms of, say, voting rights at AGMs. So do you restrict the membership to a very small group of people and say those are the only people coming to the AGM, or do you widen your horizons and say, okay, there are lots of people who have an interest in this AGM, so we will have both members of the company and then various other stakeholders in the organisation coming to our AGM. It can raise lots of complex issues for some organizations, and I've seen it work well and I've seen it work badly for some organizations. For example, you may well in your internal guidelines decide all people we identify as members outside of the company definition of our members are welcome to our AGM and will be given voting rights. That needs to be managed fairly carefully, because then you may well have a free-for-all. And if you have a very large membership, the world and its mother arrives at your doorstep for an AGM, there's maybe a substantive issue, and they may well skew the future direction of the organization through their voting rights. So it's around who you give the voting rights to at your AGMs.
Yeah, to follow on from in this instance, that is exactly what happened. So we put a cap.
Yes.
And it's a big cap,
Yes.
but it's 270. But this is where the issue comes in then, is the ending of a membership. There's a subscription fee to stop that very scenario.
Aha.
Small,
Yes.
nominal annual fee.
Yes.
If somebody then doesn't renew their fee within a year, are you legitimately entitled then to discontinue the membership and open it up for somebody else?
Yes. So the question is around if you have a structure whereby you have a very clear membership fee, so payment of the fee is contingent on being an active member with the right to actually vote at AGMs. If that person doesn't continue to pay their fees, you can of course have internal rules about how that is managed, and you can decide, okay, after a period that person will have to lose their voting rights, and then you allow other people to take their place.
That doesn't have to be written in the Constitution.
No, you could. No, the question is around whether it should be actually embedded in the Constitution, or can it be within internal rules? And you can, of course, have a set of internal rules that are not actually in the Constitution itself. So a lot of boards will rely on their Constitution for the broad brush strokes, and then they'll have internal guidelines or a board handbook for the rest of the stuff that they need to be thinking about. So tread carefully, I suppose. Yes.
Can I just ask then, somewhere in the back of my mind, is there not when you adapt your constitution, or traditionally when you had law and articles, if it was silent, it was such as memberships or fees, that you if your own documents were silent, then it automatically you took whatever the template was, or in old times it used to be whatever was in the Companies Act or that part of it. Is that not, could...
When you say silent, so your question is if your constitution is silent on the issue of membership? Is that your question? Yeah.
That it defaults to whatever the
To standard
legislation
practice.
is.
Yeah. I'm not sure now if you don't have anything specific in your constitution, is there an automatic default position on that or not? I know some organizations have decided, okay, we're not going to interfere with our constitution when it comes to this issue, but we will have a set of internal guidelines. So it might be worth just checking what is best practice in that. Of course, there are different types of members as well you may well have in place. So, thank you. That's great. We've got a question. Brilliant. I'll come back to that. So you may well have service users and their families. And don't forget, families of service users can also feel we have a legitimate right to be directly involved in this organisation. You have what may well be associate members or affiliate members, so you could have different gradations of membership as well. So just to make sure that that's clear. And also you do need to clarify how membership registers, communications with members and membership fees, and that brings us to the point of fees, if applicable, are handled at national and local level. So very important, if you are applying fees, that everybody within the family of the organisation understands how that works. And that's where, of course, necessarily you may well have quite a complicated set of guidelines developed within the organisation to provide that clarity. Okay, is that clear? Is that okay? I just have one question which has come in, and I'll just read it out. It says, I was asked 10 years ago to be treasurer for, I actually won't say the name of the organisation, so I was asked to be treasurer for an organisation. The group is an independent group who provide respite for parents by organising Easter camps and summer camps for its children. The group fundraises and receives some grants. The group is insured by a diocesan youth service. I won't go into the details. And it has no constitution. That's great. It's actually not a question, it's just illustrating a point, so I don't have to kick into answer mode on this one. So here's an interesting example, I suppose, from one of our people looking in on the camera. So it's basically a group that deals with young people with special needs, and they do fundraise and receive grants. So there is no constitution. Now, there may well be a question behind that. Why isn't there a constitution? And I would say maybe for that person, by extension to what they've just said, there may well be an issue for them. Seeing as they're in the business of raising money, I know they're connected to a diocesan service, but I would suggest to that person, have a discussion internally about how you go forward from this point, because you may well need to consider the implications of raising money in your own right. Have a look, and again, particularly for that person, have a look at the website of the Charities Institute, and I'll just go back. Bear with me 1 second. That website there, it's on the slide, at the bottom of that slide. The Charities Institute website has a section on the principles of fundraising, and it does also touch on, if you're starting out doing something like this, how do you manage it forward and how do you make sure it's going to work for you? And particularly if you grow and you develop into a fully fledged organization in your own light, how do you make sure you've got the building blocks in place? Okay, any other questions from the floor before I do my last slide? Okay, happy with that? So I'm just going to introduce Fran. Just bear with me and I'll bring up the slide. And then I'm going to bow out. So this is Fran Brennan. He's the CEO of Polio Survivors Ireland, previously known, of course, as Post-Polio Support Group. Fran and his organisation have a long-term connection with Carmichael Centre. They were actually a resident member within our walls for a number of years. And we've worked quite closely with Fran and his organisation in recent years. So we're going to take a slight break so we can get Fran hooked up to the speaker and also 2 slides which we will organise for you. So I'll sign off and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Great.
And this one here, just that little one on the right, so you've got your first slide there, your second slide there, and then to go back.
Great. Okay.
Brilliant. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Great stuff. Thanks,
You'll
Derek.
need to turn on your speaker as well.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'd like to tell you a little bit firstly about my organisation and its origins. An audience today, when you talk about polio, it needs some introduction. Decades ago, it wouldn't have. It was a massive scourge throughout centuries. In fact, some people have even speculated that Tutankhamun had polio. He certainly had a limp and he used a walking stick, but there's no real evidence to suggest what actually caused that. Nevertheless, it was there throughout history. One of the things about polio, a little bit like flu, there was always a certain underlying level of infection. But then you got waves of outbreaks which infected far more people. So most notably in Ireland in the 1950s, we had significant outbreaks in Belfast and particularly Cork, to the point where they actually suspended an All-Ireland final over the outbreak in Cork, because Cork were in the All-Ireland final. And the concern was that people coming from Cork would spread the infection to people in Dublin and elsewhere. So polio was a real big public health concern, very much at the same level as TB and other diseases, and was really only eliminated in Western Europe and North America with the advent of vaccination, widespread vaccinations in the late 50s and early 60s. But for decades afterwards, it's still been prevalent in many parts of the world, and in fact, it's still, there's still wild polio, as they call it, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Nigeria. But it's almost eliminated. So like smallpox, it's almost at the point of being consigned to history. Ironically, for polio survivors, that has some negative impacts because for them, they tend to be forgotten now. So when polio survivors go into a GP or go to a hospital, they find often that the medical professionals they're dealing with may have heard of polio, but in the same way as diseases like smallpox, it's of an academic, it's something they read a small footnote in some medical text. It means nothing to them, and they're quite surprised to see a living, walking, breathing person who's actually suffered from polio. But the reality is that actually the average polio survivor in Ireland is aged around 68. So there are thousands of polio survivors still living in Ireland. And in fact, one of their unofficial mottos is, "We're still here." And that's both a sort of a statement almost of defiance, but also a plaintive appeal to remember that they're still there. And that's in a sense what prompted the foundation of our organization in the early 1990s. Because one of the impacts of polio is that initially it can cause quite a level of disability, but many people to some extent recover from that and are able to live relatively normal lives. In fact, in the case of many of our members, the greater impact on their lives has been the fact that they spent years in hospital as children and the impact on their education. As well as other issues, psychological effects have been removed from your family for many, many years. But from a disability point of view, many actually overcame that with maybe a limp, or indeed maybe they needed to use wheelchairs. But they coped and they managed, and many went on to have families and normal lives. But then in middle ages, there's a second impact of polio called post-polio syndrome. And what it effectively does is it exacerbates the original disability. So people maybe who walked with a limp and with the aid of a walking stick find themselves in a wheelchair. People who needed a wheelchair some of the time but could walk around about the kitchen or the house suddenly find they can't get out of the wheelchair. And people also suffer from things like chronic pain and chronic fatigue. So it was a group of polio survivors who in their middle ages in the early 1990s discovered that they were experiencing this second wave of symptoms and could find nothing about it. At that time, there was completely unheard of in Ireland, and there was a little bit of research going on in the United States. So they decided to investigate it, and the more they found, the more they realized that every polio survivor potentially was at risk of these sort of secondary symptoms emerging in middle age. And so they founded our organization, which at the time was called the Post-Polio Support Group, and is now called Polio Survivors Ireland. And I think it's important just to talk about that history because our organization is very definitely a membership organization. So Derek was talking about membership organizations and you were asking a few questions about the nature of membership. Well, ours was an organization which, as far as we're concerned, was founded by and for polio survivors. And polio survivors are encouraged to join the organization. And if they join, they all have voting rights. So what that meant is that culturally and psychologically within the organization, the members are extremely strong. It's not a case where, in a sense of some organizations where we provide a service to people, but the people who run the organization are maybe medical professionals or families or other well-intentioned people concerned with that particular issue. In our case, it's very much run by the people who had polio and experienced polio themselves. And our boards have been strongly dominated by people who had polio. So that membership culture very much permeates the organization, is very much a key part of its identity. But on the other hand, we do provide services and supports to polio survivors. So in a sense, we're both a membership organization and a service provider. And a person can be a very active and indeed powerful member of the organization, but on the other hand, can actually be, as the terminology goes, a service user. And that's had interesting connotations within the organization at times. It does mean there's some complexity in terms of running the organization, and it works its way through the organization in odd ways. One of the things Derek was talking about, branch structures. We don't have branch structures. What the organisation decided to do about 10, 15 years ago was to establish a number of support groups, and it now has about 20 what we call social support groups around the country. But it's not a branch structure. The problem is that that then left some ambiguity as to what the nature of these support groups were. In a sense, I think nature abhors a vacuum. So in the absence of a branch structure, very often the board and different staff members and other parts of the organisation were looking for the support groups to undertake some organisational activities. And some support groups were happy to do it, and others felt that this was a contradiction, and this ran against what they felt was their primary role, which was to provide support for members. Indeed, when I joined the organisation 4 years ago, I frequently found myself caught in the middle of this, where somebody on the board or some member or staff member would say, why don't we get the different support groups to raise funds around the country for this programme or that programme? And then on the other hand, another board member would say, no, you can't do that. That's completely contrary to their role. And then this argument would break out. And this seemed to be going around in circles for years, that there was a lack of clarity over what indeed was the purpose of social support groups, and what about the fact that we didn't have a branch structure. And I think it's inevitable that nature abhors a vacuum, and if you don't have a branch structure, then inevitably whatever structures are there, people will seek to use them to compensate for that. This went on for some time, and eventually what we had to do was organise a series of regional meetings to thrash out the subject. So we called members together in 4 different locations around the country, and we put 3 questions to them. What sort of activities did they think the organisation needed to be doing at a local level in their regions? How should those activities be organised and managed? And should the social support groups that we already had have any role in the organisation or undertaking of those activities? There wasn't a great deal of consensus, quite frankly, coming out of those meetings, but the one thing that was very clear was that people did feel the organisation needed to be doing and undertaking different activities at a local level. But what there was no agreement on was how that should be organised, and there was no agreement on the role of social support groups. So some people felt social support groups should effectively evolve into branches, maintain their social support element, but also undertake activities on behalf of the organisation. Others felt that that was completely incompatible with their role. And indeed, people even threatened to leave the organisation if we went down that road. So there was quite strong emotions, and people had very, very strong opinions on it. So what we did coming out of those meetings was we set up a committee that looked at this issue. And people were drawn from different parts of the country who sat on that committee. And they deliberated on it for quite a significant amount of time. And eventually they came to the conclusion that the social support groups were a service to members. They were there to help the members, not to be a supporting part of the organisation or not to be an organisational unit. And that it was incompatible to expect them to undertake those sort of activities. Our members went to social support groups to be helped, not necessarily to help the organisation. And in fact, very often it was the wrong people who would have been going to social support groups, in a sense, if you were looking for them to undertake organisational activities. Because in a sense, people were going there for support, for help. They were not maybe people who were suited to or would have particular skills in the area of fundraising or promotion or recruitment or whatever else you might want the organisation to undertake. And that if you actually turn the social support groups into a branch, then many of these people would stop coming and effectively would no longer receive the service that they were benefiting from when they were attending a support group. So, in a sense, that option was excluded. So then that left the question of, should we set up a branch structure around the country? The problem with that was effectively you were replicating a whole new organisational structure of branches all around the country, and you would have 2 parallel structures. So you'd have a network of 20 branches around the country or whatever, and another network of social support groups around the country. And the committee felt that the organisation just didn't have the capacity, I guess, to organise that, and also that it would cause a lot of confusion and contradiction. So they came up with a sort of a hybrid proposal instead. they recommended the establishment of several national networks that would undertake organisational activities at a local and regional level. And these were the three networks that they proposed we set up initially. The Publicity and Campaigning Network to essentially highlight and promote the work of the organisation in local media, a fundraising network, no surprise there, and a recruitment network, which would help to coordinate locally recruitment activities to encourage people who'd had polio and their families to join the organisation. In terms then of a structure, decision was made that you would have a national coordinator of each of these networks, so 3 national coordinators, and that at a regional level, each network would have 4 coordinators. So, and I know this could be quite a confusing chart, but in a sense it was an attempt in one page to put the structure together. So you have sort of vertically here, you have each of your 3 networks with their 3 national coordinators. And then in each region, you can see our northeast region here, you would have a regional coordinator for publicity and campaigning. You would have another regional coordinator for fundraising and another regional coordinator for the recruitment activities. And the idea being at a regional level, each of these 3 people would coordinate with each other so that they wouldn't be tripping over each other, that there would be a degree of synergy going on, because obviously there's a lot of overlap. Publicity clearly has an impact on fundraising and can support fundraising. It can also support recruitment. And equally, activities around recruitment could lead to the identification of people who could be helpful for fundraising. So it was an attempt to have separate national networks, but also strong level of regional coordination. And then there was also the expectation at national level that each of the national coordinators would also meet and would communicate with each other. In actual fact, the committee also recommended that the social support service be structured in the same way, so that there could be some degree of at least cooperation and communication between all of the coordinators. So in fact, in the Northeast, you would effectively have 4 regional coordinators, 3 network coordinators and a social support coordinator, so that everything that was going on in that region, those people would be involved in it and would communicate with each other and not be, in a sense, going off on solo runs or doing things that the others weren't aware of. To support these different networks, we allocated a staff member to help. So we have a development officer who's responsible for communications and fundraising. So it made sense that she would support the publicity and campaigning network, and she would also support the fundraising network. And then separately, we have a membership and volunteer officer, and she supports the recruitment network. Now, as a structure, it works on paper. The reality is not quite the same. We've spent about 2.5 years developing these networks. The idea was that there would be around about 20 to 30 people in each network. So you're talking about maybe 60 to 80 people having to be recruited or developed as what we call active members to participate in these networks. That's a tall order, particularly when you take the average age of our membership, which is 68. So that has been a struggle, and it's been quite difficult. And particularly recruiting the coordinators, because that requires people with particular skills and abilities. And so at times, the staff members who were meant to be supporting the networks have ended up effectively running the networks. So it's very much a work in progress. Nevertheless, it has gathered momentum. We have brought in a lot of additional people into the organisation. Well, they were members of the organisation, but brought them in as volunteers, in a sense, within the organisation and developed them as volunteers to undertake different activities. And it's worked very, very well at times, but it's still very much a work in progress. It's also required the organisation to prioritise the recruitment of volunteers within the organisation to take on these different roles, and that's become a key strategic priority for the organisation. And I suppose it brings me back to essentially a sort of a misquote that occurred to me. It's what Winston Churchill referred to about democracy. Well, I would sort of take that and sort of misuse it and say that a branch structure is probably the worst type of structure you can have until you consider all other structures. And in our case, having eliminated branch structures and come up with this structure, the reality is you come back to the point of saying, well, okay, this can work, but quite frankly, if you have a branch structure, or you can develop a branch structure, in many ways it might actually be an easier structure to manage. From our point of view, we've certainly learned a lot of lessons from the structures we developed. They can work, they do work, but they require an enormous amount of effort. And I suppose that's the last thing I would say about structures, is that at the end of the day, they're both a resource and an asset to the organization, but they're also a drain on resources as well. They require investment of time, of effort, of volunteers, very often of money indeed. And so in any structure of an organization, you need to ensure that whatever it's delivering is greater than actually what it costs and the resources that it requires in order to develop it and to keep it going. So has anybody any questions on that? I have to say, I thought our structures would be so confusing that nobody would make any sense of them. So,
just, I suppose, an observation. You mentioned historically on the island of Ireland, Cork and Belfast were hotspots for polio. I presume that was back in the early 60s.
In the 50s, yeah.
In the late 50s, early 60s. Is there any connection, any meaningful connection between Northern Ireland and the Republic on polio support at this stage?
Yeah, we have joint members actually. So some of our members live in the north of Ireland. They have their own support group in the north of Ireland, and it's affiliated to the British Polio Fellowship, which would be a similar organisation to ourselves. But by having that dual membership, many of the members, in a sense, have a foot in both camps. There was an event last weekend where Rotary International, who are spearheading the eradication of polio internationally, had I suppose you might call it an awareness-raising event last week here in Dublin. And they brought down 3 speakers from the north of Ireland who are polio survivors. And we provided 3 of our people. And all 6 came together then and described their experiences in childhood and since of having polio. So we certainly do work together very closely, and we're very aware of what each organisation is doing. Okay. Thank you. I'll wait to be dewired before I move too far. Okay.
No. Okay, thank you, Fran, and thank you all for listening in. We are now breaking for lunch. However, don't forget, we have Kieran Murphy, who's got a very interesting session coming up at 2 p.m. So he'll be along at 2 p.m. So if you log back in for Kieran's, and thank you again for being with us.